Thanks for having me.
I listened to you on Sam Harris's podcast, and I was utterly stunned. I had to listen to it twice because I just couldn't. Let's get into this from the beginning. How did this start out? How did you start researching these online Russian trolls and bots and all this jazz?
Yeah, so a couple of years back, in around 2015, I had my first baby in 2013, and I was getting on these preschool lists. And what I decided to do was I started looking at anti-vaccine activity in California because I had a kid and I wanted to, put him on preschool lists where I was going to fit with the parents, basically, as someone who vaccinates. And I started looking at the way that small groups were able to kind of disproportionately amplify messages on social channels. And some of this was through very legitimate activity, and then some of it was through really kind of coordinated, deliberate attempts to kind of game ways that algorithms were amplifying content, amplifying particular types of narratives. And I thought it was interesting, and I started writing about it. And I wound up writing about ways in which hashtag gaming, ways in which people were kind of using automation to just be in a hashtag all the time. So it was kind of a way to really gain control of share of voice and what that meant when very small groups of people could achieve this kind of phenomenal amplification and what the pros and cons of that were. And then this was 2015. So the way that this sort of awareness of social media challenges came about was actually when I was working on this. Other people were looking at it from the same, looking at the same tactics, but how they were being used by ISIS, by the terrorist organization. And there also you had this very small group of people that managed to use bots and amplification to really kind of own a narrative, really push this brand, this digital caliphate, to kind of build it on all social platforms almost simultaneously. And the ways in which information was hopping from one platform to another through kind of deliberate coordination, and then also just ways in which information flowed kind of contagion style. And I wound up working on thinking about how the government was going to respond to the challenge of terrorist organizations using American social platforms to spread propaganda. So what we came to realize was that there was just this information ecosystem, and it had evolved in a certain way over a period of about 8 years or so, and the kind of unintended consequences of that. And the way that Russia kind of came into the conversation was around October 2015, when we were thinking about what to do about ISIS, what to do about terrorism, and terrorist kind of proliferation on social platforms. This was right around when Adrian Chen had written the article, The Agency, for the New York Times. And that was one of the first big exposés of the Internet Research Agency. The first time an American journalist had gone over there and actually met the trolls, been in St. Petersburg, and began to write about what was happening over there and the ways that they had pages that were targeting certain facets of American culture. So while we were in D.C. talking about what to do about terrorists using these platforms to spread propaganda, there were beginning to be rumblings that Russian intelligence and Russian entities were doing the same thing. And so the question became, can we think about ways in which the internet is vulnerable to this type of manipulation by anyone, and then come up with ways to stop it? So that was how the Russia investigation began, was actually around 2015, a handful of people started looking for evidence of Russian bots and trolls on social platforms.
So 2015, if we think about social media and the birth of social media, essentially it had only been alive for, what was Twitter, 2007, I believe?
I think so, yeah.
Something like that. So 8 years. Like 8 years of social media, and then all of a sudden they figured out how to game this system, and then they figured out how to use this to make people argue against each other.
Yeah, so I think, there was this, if you go back to you remember GeoCities and the...
Yes, sure.
Okay, AOL, Usenet.
Yeah, of course.
So we're probably about the same age. So there have always been... the thing that was great about the internet, like Internet 1.0, we can call it, right, was this idea that everybody was given a platform, and you could use your platform, you could put up your blog, you could say whatever you wanted. You didn't necessarily get attention, but you could say whatever you wanted. And so there was this kind of consolidation as social platforms kind of came into existence. Content creators were really excited about the fact that now they not only had this this access to write their own stuff, but they also had access to this audience because as the network effects got more and more pronounced, more and more people came to be on social platforms. And it originally wasn't even Facebook. If you remember, it was like, there's like Friendster and MySpace, and social networks kind of evolved. When I was in college, Facebook was still limited to like, a handful of like Ivy League schools, and so I wasn't even eligible. And as you watch this consolidation happen, you start to have this information ecosystem really dominated by a handful of companies that grow very large because they're providing a service that people really want. But there's a kind of mass consolidation of audiences onto this handful of platforms. So this becomes really interesting for regular people who just want to find their friends, reach people, spread their message, grow an audience. It also becomes really interesting for propagandists and trolls and, in this case, terrorist organizations and state intelligence services. Because instead of reaching the entire internet, they really just kind of have to concentrate their efforts on a handful of platforms. So that consolidation is one of the things that kind of kicks off some of the one of the reasons that we have these problems today.
Right. So the fact that there's only a Facebook, a Twitter, an Instagram, and a couple other minor platforms other than YouTube. I mean, anything that you can tell it's an actual person. Like YouTube is a problem, right? Because you can see it's an actual person. If you're narrating something, if you're in front of the camera and explaining things, people are going to know that you're an actual human being. Mm-hmm. Whereas there's so many of these accounts that I'll go to, like I'll watch people get involved in these little online beefs with each other, and then I'll go to some of these accounts, I'm like, this doesn't seem like a real person. And I'll go and it's like hashtag MAGA, there's an American eagle in front of a flag, and then you read their stuff and you're like, wow, this is probably a Russian troll account. And it's strange. Like you feel like you're not supposed to be seeing this. Like you're seeing the wiring under the board or something. And then you'll go through the timeline and all they're doing is engaging people and arguing, for Trump and against, whatever the fuck they're angry about, whatever it is that's being discussed. And they're basically just like some weird little argument mechanism.
Yeah, so in 2016, there was a lot of that during the presidential campaign, right? And there was so much that was written. We can go back to the free speech thing we were kind of chatting about before. There was so much that was written about harassment and trolling and negativity and these kind of hordes of accounts that would brigade people and harass them. Of course, a lot of that is just real Americans, right? There are plenty of people who are just assholes on the internet.
Sure.
But there were actually a fair number of these as we began to do the investigation into the Russian operation and it started on Twitter in about 2014, actually. So 2013, 2014, the Internet Research Agency is targeting Russian people. So they're tweeting in Russian at Russian and Ukrainian folks, people in their sphere of influence. So they're already on there. They're already trying this out. And what they're doing is they're creating these accounts. It's kind of wrong to call them bots because they are real people. They're just not what they appear to be. So I think the unfortunate term for it has become like cyborg, like semi-automated. Sometimes it's automated, sometimes it's a real person. But sock puppet is the other way that we can refer to it, a person pretending to be somebody else. So you have these sock puppets, and they're out there and they're tweeting in 2014 about the Russian annexation of Crimea, or about MH17, that plane that went down, which Russia, of course, had no idea what happened, and it wasn't their fault at all. And gradually, as they begin to experience what I imagine they thought of was success, that's when you see some of these accounts pivot to targeting Americans. And so in late 2014, early 2015, you start to see this strategy that for a long time had been very inwardly focused, making their own people think a certain way or feel a certain way or have a certain experience on the internet. It begins to spread out. It begins to look outwards. And so you start to see these accounts communicating with Americans. And as we were going through the data sets, which the Twitter data set is public, anyone can go and look at it at this point, you do see some of the accounts that are kind of, that were somewhat notorious for being really virulent, nasty trolls, anti-Semitic trolls going after journalists. Some of these accounts being revealed as actually being Russian trolls. Now, it doesn't kind of exculpate the actual American trolls that were very much real and active and part of this and expressing their opinion, but you do see that they're mimicking this. They're using that same style of tactic, that harassment, to get at real people.
And if they do get banned, if their account gets banned, they just simply make another account. They use some sort of a, what is it, a virtual server? What is that called?
You mean VPNs? Or?
VPNs, that's it. Yeah, so if they do that, they can kind of do that as long as they want. They can continue to make new accounts, and it probably also emboldens the actual American trolls because they're going to go out a little bit further than everybody else, a little bit crazier, and it kind of changes the tone of discourse within these communities that are arguing about a certain subject. Things get nastier, and they're getting nastier because of the interference of these trolls. Like, it seems like they've actually managed to not just cause a lot of discourse, but to change the way people are interacting with each other and to make it more vicious. Yeah.
So what they're doing is they're operating in communities. So one of the really common criticisms of people who a lot of people think that this didn't have a huge impact, did it swing the election? We have no idea. But what it does do in the communities that it targets is it can change that tone, and that's where you see. I think everybody's probably had this experience. You're part of a group and then a new person gets added to the group and the dynamic changes.
Yes.
It's very much the same kind of thing, just that these are not real people who are joining the group. And so there's this opportunity to kind of expand the bounds of tolerance just that little bit more, or try to normalize using particular ways of communicating that maybe a group wouldn't naturally gravitate to, but then it does. So there are definitely ways in which any type of troll doing this, doesn't have to be a Russian troll, has this ability to kind of shift the language, shift the community, shift the culture just a little bit.
Now, why did the agency do this? And do we know? Do we have someone who's ever left there or become a whistleblower who can give us some information about what the mandate was and how it was carried out?
There have been a couple of whistleblowers and actually some investigative journalism in Russia that's covered this. They describe the employees of so it's the Internet Research Agency. So it's a little bit like a social media marketing agency, plus tactics that we would not expect a social media marketing agency to use. Things that are a little more like what you would expect to see from an intelligence agency. So besides just making your pages and your blogs and your social posts, they're also in there kind of connecting with real people and real activists and pretending to be something that they're not, to develop kind of a one-on-one relationship. But most of the whistleblowers who have come out, there's a woman named Ludmila Savachuk. She wrote an expose, I believe, on this, and it's described as being much like you would expect if you were doing social media grunt work. You have a certain number of posts per day. You're trying to get a certain amount of engagement. You've got to kind of hit your quotas. Most people are young millennials, the people that work there. They're well-versed in trolling culture. They're well-versed in internet culture. They're up to speed on like popular memes and things like that. And so you do see this, and then the other thing that they do is they talk about in the Mueller indictment, you see some really interesting descriptions of like the stand-ups that they have. Stand-up is a thing you do at a tech company where everybody kind of stands up and talk about your goals and responsibilities and blockers and things. And in these stand-ups, they would be sitting there saying things like, if you're targeting Black LGBT people, make sure you don't use white people in your image and your meme because that's going to like trigger them. So trying to get at the very niche rules for communicating authentically in an American community, which, as online, you sometimes there are very specific ways in which a community expects a member of that community to communicate.
Yeah. And
so they are in there, and you can read in these filings by Mueller's team and by the Eastern District of Virginia, the degree of granularity that they have to recognize that if you are running a Black LGBT page and your meme is of white people, you're going to cause some tension and consternation. And assuming that that's not necessarily what you want to be doing, you should go find the meme of Black LGBT people to put in the, to put as your meme for the day. So there's a lot of sophistication. There's a lot of understanding of American culture. And then there's a lot of understanding of trolling culture. And so these things combine to be a rather effective very effective social media agency.
And is there an overwhelming sort of narrative that they're trying to pursue, that they're trying to push?
So what we saw, so I did some of the research for the Senate, and the Senate data came from the platforms. So what I had was the attribution was made by the platforms. It wasn't like Renée deciding this was IRA. It was the platforms giving it to our government. And the information in there, what it showed was that across all platforms, across Twitter, across Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, they were building up tribes. So they were really working to create distinct communities of distinct types of Americans. And that would be, for example, there's an LGBT page that is very much about LGBT pride. There's
and they created it.
And they created it.
And they curate it, and they
curate it. It has there's like a persona. A lot of the posts on the LGBT page were written by what sounded kind of like a millennial lesbian was the voice. So it was a lot of, memes of LGBT actresses, and they would brand it with a specific brand mark. It was a rainbow heart. LGBT United was the name of the page. It had a matching Instagram account, which you would also expect to see from a media property, right? You would expect them to see in both places. And this,
And what were they pushing?
It read like a young woman talking about crushes on actresses and things. Actually, it was really, besides the sometimes wonky English, virtually indistinguishable from what you would read on any kind of like young millennial focused social page. It wasn't. None of it was radical or divisive. It wasn't like the way that they got the division across was they built these tribes where they're reinforcing in-group dynamics. So you have the LGBT page, you have numerous pages targeting the Black community. That was where they spent most of their energy. A lot of pages targeting far right. So both old far right, meaning people who are very concerned about what does the future of America look like, and then young far right, which was much more angry, much more like trolling culture. So they recognize that there's a divide there, that the kinds of memes you're going to use to target younger right-wing audiences are not the same kinds of memes you're going to use to target older right-wing audiences. So there's a tribe for older right-wing, younger right-wing. In the Black community, there's a Baptist tribe. There's a Black liberation tribe. There's a Black women tribe. There's one for people who have incarcerated spouses. There's a Brown Power, I believe was the name of it, page that was very much about Mexican and Chicano culture. There was Native Americans United.
And all of these are fake.
All these are fake.
All these are fake. And what are they trying to do with all these?
So you build up this in-group dynamic, and they did this over years. So this was not a short-term thing. They started these pages in 2014, 2015 timeframe, most of them. They started some other ones that were much more political later. We can talk about the election if you want to. But with this tribal thing, you're building up tribes. So you're saying, like, as Black women in America, this is here's posts about things that we care about. Here's posts about Black hair. Here's posts about child rearing. Here's posts about fashion and culture. And then every now and then there would be a post that would reinforce, like, as Black people, we don't do this. And so, or as LGBT people, we don't like this. And so you're building this rapport. So like me and you, we're having a conversation, we're developing a relationship on this page over time. And then I say, like, as this kind of person, we don't believe this. So it's a way to subtly influence by appealing to an in-group dynamic, or appealing to, like, as members of this tribe, as LGBT people, of course we hate Mike Pence. As Black people, of course we're not going to vote because, we hate Hillary Clinton because we hate her husband. As people who are concerned about the future of America, as Texas secessionists, so everything is presented as members of this tribe. We think this. As members of this tribe, we don't think this.
But a lot of the posts, but a lot of the posts were not even political. They were just sort of affirming the standards of the tribe.
Yes.
So they were kind of setting up this whole long game.
Yep.
And then once they got everybody on board, how many followers do these pages have? So
there was kind of a long tail. There were I think 88 pages on Facebook and 133 Instagram accounts. And I would say maybe 30 of the Facebook pages had over 1,000 followers, which is not very many. And then maybe the top 10 had upwards of 500,000 followers. So there's, you know, same way you run any social campaign, sometimes you have hits, sometimes you have flops.
Right.
And what was interesting with the flops is you would see them repurpose them. So they would decide, you know, the same way if you're running a social media agency, well, we've got this audience, this page isn't doing so well, let's like rebrand it a little bit, change it up, try to make it appeal to somebody else. So,
like, what did
so
they
you
do?
do see this. I got this data set and I was going through these Instagram memes, and 133,000 of them. And I was there was a cluster of images of Kermit the Frog. I was like, what the hell is Kermit the Frog doing in here? And the way the platforms provide the data is I got like a CSV of the posts, and then I got a folder of the images. And so in order to like connect the dots, I had to have the image up on one screen and the CSV up on the other screen.
CSV?
It's like a spreadsheet.
Okay.
Yeah. And we turned it into a database that we could track things a little bit more easily across the platforms. But so I have this cluster of Kermit the Frog memes, and I go and I look and I realize that they're attributed to an account called Army of Jesus. And I thought, well, that's interesting. These are, some of them are really raunchy. it was like Kermit Miss Piggy, I mean, it was just like stupid, crappy memes attached to Army of Jesus, and what the hell is going on here? And I keep going through it, hundreds of Kermit memes. And then I get to a post where they say like, this page is owned by Homer Simpson now. Kermit went to jail for being like, I don't know, they made some joke. It was stupid. And all of a sudden, the data set turns into Homer Simpson memes. So again, like this kind of raunchy Homer Simpson culture. And again, it's attributed to Army of Jesus. And then I go through all this and realize that they didn't get to actually making Army of Jesus a Jesus-focused page until like 900 posts in. So they just renamed the account at some point. It used to be called Nuts News. And then Nuts News was what they called it when it was the Kermit the Frog meme page. And then it gets repurposed when they realize Kermit's not doing it. It's not getting the audience they want. Homer Simpson's not getting the audience or engagement they want. And then they pivot over to Jesus. And then all of a sudden they start, the likes and things start pouring in. So what they're doing is they're actually like either deliberately or they're just creating placeholders. It's kind of a red flag when a brand new account that was created yesterday suddenly starts talking about some highly politically divisive thing or whatever. But if you lay the groundwork and you do it over a period of 2 years, then somebody who goes and checks to see what the account was, where it came from, how old it is going to see something that was 2 years old. So it's an opportunity to create almost like sleeper accounts where you create them now and then you activate them, you politicize them, you actually put them to use a couple of years in the future. So we saw all kinds of, we saw this over and over again. There was a Black Guns Matter account that turned into an anonymous account at one point. They were pretending to be anonymous, the hacktivist. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they repurposed this Black Guns Matter page, which just had, it was advocating that Black people buy weapons and carry, and it's like a pro-Second Amendment page, but for the Black community. And then they took that page when it wasn't getting, I guess, a ton of engagement, and it became, it was called, oh gosh, I don't remember the exact name of the anonymous page, and I don't want to say it was something that's legit, but they pivoted it into an anonymous page. Yeah.
And when they do that, do they go back and repurpose the content of the earlier posts? Do they change?
That was not clear. That wasn't clear. We didn't get that information from the platforms. There was a lot of stuff that I would have loved to have more insight into. We could see, again, you'd think if you started following an Army of Jesus page and you had all this raunchy Kermit shit from like a year ago, that would raise some flags. I would assume that they scrubbed it and restarted, but I don't know. Your
podcast with Sam changed how I look at a lot of the pages that I actually follow, because I follow some pages like that have classic cars or something like that, and then I'll see them, and most of it is just photographs of cars, like beautiful old cars, and it'll have, they'll have a giant following, and then all of a sudden something will get political, and I'll look at it and go, oh wow, like this is probably one of those weird accounts. Like they're getting people to get engaged with it because it represents something that they're interested in, like classic muscle cars. And then they use it for activism, and they use it to get this narrative across.
I think I mean, I've seen it happen with some of mine too. I think one of the challenges is like, you want people to be aware that this stuff exists, but you don't want them to be paranoid that it's everywhere.
I am paranoid.
I know.
That's a problem. Everybody's a troll now.
I look at this all day long, and sometimes I see things, and I'm like, well, what are the odds? But I try to, not feel like, you don't want to feel like you're in some like Tom Clancy novel, but
yes.
It's this balance between when you make people aware of it, and I think people deserve to be aware of it. They deserve to understand how this plays out. The flip side of that is you do wind up in these weird, you see it happen on social media now where click into a Trump tweet and you'll see like, you're a Russian bot. No, you're a Russian bot. No, you're like, they're probably not Russian bots. It's everybody you don't like on the internet is not a Russian bot.
Yeah, some are just assholes.
Exactly. And so that's where you get at the interesting conversations of, in some ways, getting caught. This is one of the challenges with running disinformation campaigns, right? It makes it really hard for people to know what's real after the fact. It leaves you a little bit off balance, right? Feel like, when you feel like you can't quite tell what's real, and that's part of the goal, right? It's to make you not feel entirely balanced in your information environment. Is this real? Is this not? And so in some ways, there's not much downside to doing this.
Right.
Because you do, if you either knock it out of the park and you influence the election and you influence people and you have this secret covert operation going on for years, or you get caught and then there's until there's some confidence in the ability of platforms to detect this stuff, there's real concern among everybody that you're encountering something fake.